I'm part of the Center for Household Financial Stability at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and what we do is we study household balance sheets. So what are those? Well, they're looking at what households own, what they owe, and what they earn. So assets, liabilities, and income. And we often look at wealth or net worth as the difference between assets and liabilities. This is joint work with Dr. Emmons and Dr. Ken. They wish they could be here tonight, but they're both traveling at different parts of the country. Actually, Bill is in Israel on a vacation, a much-needed vacation, I think. So they could not be here. Daphne mentioned the disclaimer. I'll say it again quickly. These are my own views, not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, the FOMC, or President Bullard. All right, so what I'm going to be talking to you tonight is really about economic challenges facing black men and boys. And here's kind of a roadmap of where we're going to be going. So a lot of this is going to be at the national level. The information on presented in the Demographics of Wealth series is all going to be national. We unfortunately don't have geographic detail for that. It's actually an incredibly hard thing to come by. So we're going to also complement that work with an incredible research paper by Raj Chetty and co-authors that came out last year. And there's going to be a brief look at Memphis in particular. But I think a lot of the trends that are going to be presented here will also be relevant for Memphis as a community. So I'm going to go over income and wealth gaps by race and ethnicity. This is work from our own shop. And then we're going to look at intergenerational economic challenges among black men and boys. And this is the Raj Chetty data. And specifically, it's going to be looking at intergenerational income mobility. And a spoiler alert, their team show that black boys' opportunities depend on the presence of black fathers and a low level of racial bias, as well as a low incidence of poverty in a community. A lot of their work is going to be at the community level. And unfortunately, what they find is that a vast majority of black boys grow up in low opportunity neighborhoods. We're going to be talking a little bit more about what are these low opportunity neighborhoods. So this is the Demographics of Wealth series. It relies on the Federal Reserve Board Survey of Consumer Finances. It's really the gold standard of balance sheet data. As I mentioned, it's very hard to come to this data because it requires an accounting of everything that is on a household balance sheet. What they own, what they owe. Well, there's a lot of different places you can put assets, such as a checking account. It could be the value of your car. It could be financial assets. So you kind of understand why this data is not as readily available and why research on this is not as widespread as, say, income. So we wanted to take this incredible resource and use it to look at specific demographic traits, race and ethnicity, what we're going to be talking about tonight, education, that of an individual household, but also their parents, looking at the linkages over time of parental educational attainment, and then also age and birth year. And recently some of our work has looked at birth cohorts. So what generation were you born into, and why that might matter for financial outcomes like income, wealth, and other socioeconomic outcomes. And what we find is that these demographic traits are incredibly powerful at predicting financial outcomes. These are the fault lines within the U.S. household distribution by which we can look at households that are increasingly doing well and households that are increasingly struggling to achieve financial milestones. So we're going to start with the income gap, and let me kind of talk through how we measure it. We're talking about a median, so this is going to be the typical or middle family. If you lined up all the families in the income distribution, it's exactly in the middle. Why do we look at that versus an average? Well, given how skewed income and wealth are in the U.S., it's less sensitive to those extremes and is maybe more representative of a typical family in our eyes. We adjust it for inflation or rising price levels over time. And taking the trend line all the way back to 1989, this is the first year the modern survey of consumer finances was available, and going to the latest data point on the right, which is 2016. This is the window we're looking at. Every 3 years the survey comes out. We've got three groups here, all measured relative to white levels, which you see in that black bar at 100. So this is a percentage of white outcomes. And you can see over time there's a gradual upward drift, which is good. That's convergence, right? Black and Hispanic, the typical income observed among these families is converging towards whites, leading to greater racial equity on this benchmark. But it still remains very far, right? 40% lower. And we look at a typical other race family you see in purple. What is other races? Well, this is every other racial and ethnic group lumped together. We don't do that. I'll stick it on the board. The Board of Governors, due to the confidentiality of the survey and a low sample size, lumps together all these groups. We would much rather have all these groups broken out because we know from series like The Color of Wealth, published by the Boston Fed and Derek Hamilton and others, that there's incredible diversity of experience within these groups and within Black, Hispanic, and other racial and ethnic groups. So that's not something that we're not sensitive to, but unfortunately, it is a data limitation. So what do wealth gaps look like? This is looking specifically at the white-black wealth gap. What am I showing you in orange on the bottom is the median wealth of Black families for all the survey years. What is the blue line at the very top? That's the median wealth outcome among white families. What is the line in the middle? That's the 75th percentile for Black families. So the upper 3/4 mark of the distribution. So why do I put that there? It's just to show you how extremely different these wealth distributions are between white families and Black families in the United States. We haven't even seen convergence of the 75th percentile of Black families to the 50th, the median for whites. So incredible gaps here. If you look at just the comparison of the median, the typical Black family has 10 cents to the dollar of the typical white family. So that's another way to think about these wealth gaps and how extreme they are. Here's the picture for among white and Hispanic families, and very similar results, right? And what you see here overall, these pictures that are showing us, is over a nearly 3-decade period, these wealth gaps have moved around a little bit, certainly, but they really have been persistent, right? There's been very little progress closing these wealth gaps over time. And if you sum up all the wealth of among white families and Black families and the rest of the families in the U.S. household distribution, in 2016, 89% of all wealth in the U.S. was held by white families versus 3% each for Black and Hispanic. And that, of course, is a much lower percentage than their representation in the household population. So when it comes to wealth gaps and race and ethnicity, these are some of the most extreme that we see. So our work had then kind of went to, well, what is the intersection of education and race? Since higher education, a college degree, is such a powerful tool for upward mobility, can that close these extreme wealth gaps that we observe? And let me really belabor this point here, because when we first started to do this work, the messaging got a little scary when interpreted by others. We find that a college degree leads to higher expected earnings and wealth for all racial groups. So we are not saying that a college degree does not pay on average. It does for all racial groups. What we are saying is the returns are really unequal across these groups, and that even at the highest levels of higher education, you continue to see the racial wealth gap. And here's what happens if we split the entire household population by race and ethnicity into two groups. Those families that have a 4-year college degree and those families that don't. This seems to be, at least when financial outcomes are analyzed, an important breaking point within the population. And on the right versus the left, you see what I'm saying, that a college education leads to higher expected wealth for all racial and ethnic groups. But the gaps remain. Among college-educated peers, that black-white gap improves from 10 cents to the dollar to 17 cents to the dollar, but obviously it's a very extreme gap remains after that. So what's going on here? Well, to kind of sum up very quickly some further work, Bill Emmons and I put together a research paper that concludes that structural, systemic, and other unobservable factors related to race and ethnicity are likely important drivers of wealth inequality. And there's a research paper that I can share with you. But really what we're talking about here is historical discrimination and disadvantage, in particular state-sponsored asset appreciation programs that were specifically omitting black families and other families of color, created large wealth gaps in the past, which profoundly affect today's children and adults. And that today, ongoing, while these explicit barriers have fallen, it's not hard to understand that these intergenerational wealth connections can lead to existing barriers today for adults and ongoing structural systemic barriers, some of which Chetty et al. Really allude to at the neighborhood level, make it difficult to narrow wealth gaps. So that's some of our work, and we're going to switch gears to talk about Chetty's work. And I'm going to move very quickly. Hold on to your questions, pepper me in the Q&A, because I only have so much time to get through some of this material. So apologize if it's rather quick. So we're going to first define, what do we mean by intergenerational income mobility? You know, it's a big word. We're going to shorten that to IG, income mobility. What we're doing here, and what Chetty et al. Do, is measure parents' income while a child is a teenager, right? And then they look forward 20 years later and measure the child's income in his or her 30s, right? This is an incredible data set. It really is. And I'll go into that in a second. But think about two extreme cases that'll really help, I think, benchmark your thinking on this. One is if there is perfect intergenerational income rigidity. So you end up exactly like your parents, exact same ranking in the income distribution. Now think of the polar opposite, perfect intergenerational income mobility, where your parents' income predicts nothing about where you will end up in the income distribution. Everyone is equally likely to end up rich or poor. Well, in the US, the data suggests that we're somewhere in between, but there are strong differences by race and location. And so this is really the best data set. You might ask, well, why is this researcher talking about someone else's paper? Well, it's just that good. This data was incredible. They basically have the entire US population in their sample. They use census short forms merged with IRS data to track over time this income, and it has incredible granularity. It has incredible demographic dimensions. It first came out, a write-up in the New York Times. I encourage you to check this out if you didn't see it. It has a wonderful infographic that really shows the upward and downward mobility of these different groups. The underlying research paper is here. Here are all the names that go alongside Dr. Chetty's, which I think is important to point out. These two researchers, Maggie Jones and Sonia Porter at the Census Bureau, were integral to this study getting off the ground, leveraging the census data within it. You can check out more of their groundbreaking work at opportunityinsights.org. So we're going to look at this table briefly. We're going to look at the 5 different groups they analyze: white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, and Black. And you're going to see the mean income percentile. So averaged over this group, of the parents in the 1990s, this is where the average average parent or household unit ranked. So whites, 58th percentile, 49th for Asians, 36 for Hispanic, 37 for Native Americans, and 33. So you see already gaps by typical ranking across race and ethnicity for parents. Let's trace where their children end up on average. And you can see that whites remain at, on average, 56th percentile. Asian and Hispanic, these groups of individuals actually have a lot of upward mobility, plus 12 rungs on the ladder, if you would, and plus 10 rungs. Native Americans have roughly no mobility observed among their children, and Black families have slight mobility as well, but very little for white and Black children. And I want to caveat the Asian numbers observed here. They actually differentiate within their study that there's a difference between native-born Asian families and first-generation Asian families, the latter having much higher rates of upward mobility. And as these families, the generations persist, you're likely to see a lower long-run upward mobility. It's going to kind of stay steady at that point. So over time, what do they project in the long run? They project that there's not going to be a lot of mobility from this point forward, other than what we observe in Asian and Hispanic families, unless some of the underlying levers in society and the neighborhoods of opportunity, the distribution of those, change fundamentally. So this kind of gets to what I think Bill and I were thinking of with systemic and structural factors. So why has Black upward mobility stalled? There's two factors here. One is a low rate of upward intergenerational mobility, doing better than your parents among low-income Black children. But there's also, and this is really disturbing, is a high risk of downward mobility, doing worse than the parents among high-income Black children. And what the study found specifically was for those Black children born into the highest quintile of family income, they were equally as likely to end up in the bottom quintile of household income as they were to stay at the top as adults themselves. Just think about that for a moment. In comparison, among white children that grew up in that highest income quintile, they were 5 times more likely to stay in that quintile as adults than to fall into the lowest quintile. So extreme differences in downward mobility observed among these children. And Chetty et al. Liken it to Black children continue to fall behind their white peers even if their parents catch up. So that was particularly startling and disturbing in the data, and really begged a lot of questions. So they also find, and again highlighting the just granularity of this data set, is that there's a fault line between Black boys and girls. Black girls are just as upwardly mobile, they find, as white girls with the same parental income. But Black boys are not. They're much more likely to earn incomes far below white boys, even with the same parental income. And that Black girls' high school completion and college attendance rates actually exceeded those of white boys. This is actually really a silver lining of this work, right? This is incredible. The numbers were very heartening. But unfortunately, when we're talking about families and the intergenerational mobility, you rise and fall together, unfortunately, when it comes to the overall group. So the challenges confronted by Black boys and subsequently Black men continue to hamper white girls and women. So there's large regional and neighborhood variation. I'm going to really cut short this section. But they find that there's a lot more intergenerational income mobility for Black children in parts of the South, the Northeast and West, but the deindustrializing cities, or the industrialized cities of the Midwest, have particularly poor outcomes. And what Black boys are especially vulnerable to is bad, low opportunity neighborhoods, regardless of income. They find that Memphis is in between. I think that's very heartening. Much better than Chicago, which had some particularly pervasive low opportunity neighborhoods, but not quite as good as some neighborhoods in New Orleans or parts of New York. So why are Chicago neighborhoods so much worse than New Orleans for Black boys? There's 3 different areas that they discount, which are important, because I think there's some kind of potentially pernicious theories here that they debunk. It's not, and this is what I'm talking about, it's not particularly due to race-related shortcomings. It's not an ability gap, because Black girls do much better than Black boys and white girls and white boys in certain respects. So they do not find that to resonate with the data. It's not primarily due to individual family structure or marriage rates, because they actually find that while the presence of a father in a child's life is important, it's not as important as presence of fathers overall in the neighborhood. It's an important distinction. And this was a theory that kind of shocked me. I've often thought that school quality and the neighborhood-based funding models leading to schools that lack resources to provide for their children was a strong theory in my mind, but they find that really school quality doesn't speak to these gaps in mobility, because Black boys also do worse even in good schools. So those are 3 theories that they debunk. So what is it? What is this special mix? And it's really all at the neighborhood level. They find that Those high opportunity neighborhoods are those that have a high fraction of fathers present in the neighborhood. Dad in the house is good, but many black dads in the neighborhood is even better. And also low levels of racial bias. And how do they measure that? They really look at a racial animus index developed from Google searches. It's kind of some cutting edge stuff. I mean, you can be critical of it potentially because it's a bit of a black box in my mind on what goes into that. But based on those measures of racial animus, they find that particularly for black boys and girls are hurt more for high levels of these indices than other children of other races. But they also find, interestingly, that white hostility hurts lower income whites as well. But unfortunately, Chicago and some of the neighborhoods that struggle within it are more typical than successful neighborhoods such as those in New Orleans. And I want to say that these are specific neighborhoods within the cities. It's not the city at large, right? There can be a wide variety of opportunity. And I encourage you to look at the policy brief as well as the actual paper for other neighborhoods and their characteristics across the U.S. But neighborhoods with low poverty, many black fathers present, and low racial hostility from whites are very rare. They find that only 5% of black children grow up in these high opportunity neighborhoods. So in sum, black-white income and wealth gaps are large and intractable because black intergenerational income and wealth mobility are low. I didn't present numbers on intergenerational wealth mobility. We're just looking at cross-sectional results. For that, I would encourage you to look at Fabian Pfeffer's work. He's at the University of Michigan. He's an excellent sociologist up there, and he uses a different resource to look at how wealth transfers across families. And he finds incredible differences by race and ethnicity. And so I'd encourage you to look at that work as well. So Raj Chetty's team believes the key is increasing the opportunities facing black boys. Make these high opportunity neighborhoods more prevalent at large for young black boys and girls. But I think this is the policy question, and I don't have specific recommendations. I think, honestly, to be candid, I think the results in the paper are kind of a hand toss. They call for more black mentors in the community, lowering racial animus, but exactly what the policy levers there, or if that's going to scale and be sufficient, I'm not quite convinced. So it's kind of a big question mark. But at least with the power of this research, you can look at specifically what neighborhoods are succeeding. I will call out that within the paper, they find incredible differences in incarceration rates, not only at the lowest quintile. I think of the lowest quintile of black parents, 20% had an incarcerated father, something along those lines. And even at the highest income quintile, there were pronounced differences in incarceration rates between blacks and whites. And the paper doesn't really speak too much to how much that can really influence, but obviously it has a role to play in the one factor of a low opportunity neighborhood. So I would suggest kind of work in that space to maybe speak to where we could move forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists. Thank you.